Well, I see you've stuck around in Nevermore Hollows for another season. I promise you that it will be filled with tales of the surreal and the macabre. I am Lafayette Faust. From my secret location, I expose the people and the creatures that are always working evil upon this quaint little town. And tonight, we start off Season 2 with one of the strangest stories yet. Anson Blight is a congressman from Nevermore. He's an arrogant man who craves absolute power. As you know, what your heart desires, especially if it should be evil, can be used against you if you're not careful. Anson craves power so intensely that one afternoon at Winona's Waffle Hut, he allows himself to be enticed by a beautiful waitress who offers him the secret special of the day and a promise that it will bring him his heart's deepest desire. Needless to say, here in Nevermore Hollows, you should never trust a promise from anyone, because, as Anson Blight soon finds out, it could lead to a fate much worse than death. So, as you savor that dark morsel, I invite you to sit back, turn on a light, and prepare yourself. Anson Blight was a proud man. He was smart, rich, and good-looking. He had earned his first million before turning 30 by creating a popular gaming app that secretly collected personal data. He then sold that data to nefarious companies for huge sums of money. Anson loved his wealth and used it to fuel his materialism. He drove a Bentley, lived in one of Nevermore's biggest mansions, and dressed in $5,000 suits. But, as much as he cherished wealth, what he coveted was power. He had come to understand that real power came not from running a successful business, but by peddling influence. He had made a dozen connections with shady politicians who taught him that holding office was the best way to gain the influence you needed to gain immense wealth and power. So, he successfully ran for Congress, and after 10 years as a politician, he was worth over $100 million and wielded enough power that he was on the verge of running for the most formidable position of influence in the world, the presidency of the United States. On most days, he had Andre, his personal chef, prepare a healthy lunch from the finest organic ingredients. However, on this Friday afternoon, he had a lunch meeting with the mayor of Nevermore at Winona's Waffle Hut, located on the outskirts of town. Anson hated the diner, though the owner, Winona, and her right-hand man, Isaac, kept the establishment pristine. But the mayor liked it because he proudly considered himself one of the common folks. Anson hated the hoi polloi that frequented Winona's, but understood that the art of being a successful politician was the ability to make the sheeple believe he was a member of their unwashed flock. So, Anson pushed aside his disgust and agreed to the meeting. The mayor was late, as usual, so Anson turned his mind to one of his favorite ways of passing the time, which was what he called his solution fantasies. Being a man of power, he was plagued by political opponents who created all sorts of problems for him as he maneuvered through Congress, pushing various agendas. He was adept at the art of blackmail, but he had not yet exercised the power to have anyone murdered. He had a perverse imagination, though, and often got great satisfaction by fantasizing about all the ways he would murder the people who pissed him off. Death was the ultimate solution to any problem. If someone was in your way, whether it be a business deal or a political agenda, just murder them. His solution fantasies did not need to be entirely about murder. He would often devise disturbing scenarios in which his enemies would meet untimely deaths, simply because he liked the idea of them dying in grisly fashion. Anson had been sitting for 15 minutes, mentally creating a gruesome death for his greatest political opponent, Congresswoman Tiffany DeLay, when the mayor called with an apology that he was not going to be able to make their meeting. Anson was thankful that he wouldn't have to sit another moment in this shitty little booth in this shitty little diner, so he pocketed his phone and moved to scoot out of the booth when the waitress sashayed over. "Leaving so soon?" she said. "You haven't ordered anything yet." Anson looked up, preparing to flash her his insincere yet vote-winning smile and give her his self-important excuse about needing to attend to the people's business, but found himself at a loss for words. The girl was gorgeous, and she carried herself with a grace and confidence that far exceeded what he expected a lowly waitress at a dive diner to possess. He stammered. He glanced at the tag on her uniform, which informed him her name was Angel. "For a politician, you sure don't seem to have a command of the language," Angel said with a playful smile. Anson cleared his throat. "Forgive me," he said. "I was lost in thought, and you startled me." Angel's green eyes were bright with life, deep with intelligence, and seemed to pierce beyond his "I'm just one of the people" facade. "I doubt a man of your ability is so easily startled by such a simple waitress as me. Surely you aren't going to attempt to be about the people's business on an empty stomach, are you? How about you let me tell you about the special of the day?" Anson was excellent at reading people. He sensed that Angel was not only an intelligent girl, but also crafty. But the twinkle in her eyes and the playful smile on her lips also assured him she was not just fishing for a large tip. She seemed to be genuinely flirting with him. So, being a man of exquisite taste, he decided to give this stunning girl some of his time, with the goal of coaxing her back to his mansion and into his bed. He scooted back into the booth and said, "I'm very interested to hear the special of the day." Angel tilted her head, pursed her lips, and gave him a look that suggested she were reading his deepest thoughts. Then she said, "The special is off menu." Anson was intrigued by this woman. He was skilled at accurately reading people, but for some reason he couldn't quite understand. He felt that he could not trust her. But when she raised her eyebrows and seductively tapped the tip of the pen against her lips, he didn't care if he could trust her or not. She was too beautiful, and he would order whatever crappy food she suggested if it got her back to his mansion. Though he felt the surge of suspicion, he wondered if she were referring to herself when she said the special was off menu. Anson flashed her his most confident smile. "I prefer off menu. You're more likely to be surprised and much more satisfied." Angel bit her lower lip. His desire welled up. "Are you a brave man?" she asked. "I'm brave," he said. "I only ask because sometimes people think they know what they want, but when they get it, they realize it's not as satisfying as they thought it might be." Anson was now sure this beauty was hitting on him, but he continued to sense that she wasn't completely genuine. She was at the least a coquette, at most a full-on tease. She might be playing with him for her own twisted pleasure, or she might come home with him. He liked a challenge, so he decided to continue playing along. "I'm sure I'll be satisfied with whatever it is you have to offer," he said. Angel hesitated for a moment, as if she were sizing him up. Okay. I sense you're a man of taste, and being a successful man, you clearly like to take risks. So, I'm going to suggest pie for lunch. Anson wasn't sure if she were using a double entendre or not. Her seductive tone suggested she was, but there was still something emanating from her that suggested she was not. Then he had a disturbing thought. What if she's trying to set me up? I have enemies back in D.C. that suspect I'm going to announce my candidacy for president. Did they hire this stunning woman to catch me in a sexual indiscretion that will ruin my chances before I even have a chance to run? Angel seemed to understand his hesitation. I'm just a waitress. You're just a man. I'm offering you something unusual for lunch. And I can tell you, if you take the risk, your dreams will come true. Anson decided to be direct. I'm confused as to whether or not you're flirting with me and to where it will lead. I appreciate a man who is direct, Angel said. So let me return the favor so that there is no misunderstanding. All I'm offering is a slice of pie. But it's not just any pie. It's made from an ancient recipe. If you're man enough to eat a slice, whatever your heart desires, you'll receive it. Let me get this straight, Anson said, still thoroughly confused about whether this girl was playing with him or seducing him. This was the most enticing conversation he'd had in a long time, so he decided to continue playing along. A slice of pie will help me get my heart's desire, no matter what it is. Angel nodded. Anson thought he saw something dark squirm in the depths of her bright green eyes. The truth of your heart. That thing you really want in the deepest chamber of your heart, that's what you'll get. Anson was so off balance with this woman and the strange conversation that he didn't know how to respond. After a long moment, he decided to throw caution to the wind and go along. Besides, he found that he liked how off balance this woman made him. It was exhilarating. Girl, I have no clue what you're up to, but I'm intrigued. If what you're saying is true, then I'll be the most powerful man in the world. Bring me the pie. Angel gave a nod, turned, and strode off to the kitchen. He took in her long, athletic legs and the sway of her hips, and his desire flashed into a white-hot flame. She was gone only a few heartbeats, and when she returned, she placed a small plate in front of him that contained a slice of pie containing vivid crimson filling. She placed a napkin on the left side of the plate and a fork on the right. Anson considered the treat in front of him, noting that the filling had small pieces of deep red fruit resembling oddly shaped cherries. I've never seen fruit like this, he said. What is it? They're ravenberries, Angel said, and they're what gives this pie its magic. Her look challenged him to stop asking questions and to eat. Anson picked up the fork and cut into the flaky crust. The crimson filling was thick and rich. He counted 13 of the weirdly shaped ravenberries. Where do they come from? They're not hard to find, if you know where to look, Angel said. Why are you hesitating? I thought you had refined taste and a willingness to try the exotic. Anson looked for the dark squirm in her eyes, but saw only deep pools of green with a playful sparkle. He felt silly letting this woman put him so off balance, but at the same time, he could not remember the last time anyone had so intrigued him. And if he were completely honest, he couldn't remember the last time he had felt such a magnetic sexual attraction. So, not wanting to lose his opportunity to take Angel home, he decided to relish the uncertainty of the moment and he took a bite of the pie. It was at once a mixture of the most delicious and most unique flavors he had ever tasted. The crust was feather light. The dark red filling was a curious mix of sweet and salty, and the ravenberries were firm, bursting apart between his teeth and coating his tongue with tangy juice. He suppressed a moan of delight when he swallowed, savoring the nectar of the ravenberries. Without realizing that he had done so, he shoved 2 more forkfuls of the curious pie into his mouth. "Oh my gosh," he said as he chewed. Without looking up, he took another bite, and another, and yet another. "This is the most exquisite thing I've ever tasted. You made this? I must have the recipe so that I can give it to my personal chef." He looked up, but Angel was gone. He glanced around the diner, looking for her, wanting to not only take her home so he could ravish her, but so that he could make her promise that she would give him the recipe for this delectable treat. When he did not immediately see her, his heart quickened, and he realized it wasn't only because he might not get to ravish her, but also because this might be the last time he would ever get to savor this pie. After a moment, another waitress sauntered over. She was in her 60s, had a mole on her cheek with 3 long hairs, and it was at least 40 pounds overweight, the exact opposite of Angel. The tag on her shirt declared her name was Margaret. "Hey, darling, anybody got your order yet?" she asked. "Yes," he said, annoyed. "Angel has been here helping me. Can you go get her, please? I really need to see her. Ask her for more Ravenberry pie." Margaret gave him a confused look. "You okay, darling? There ain't no waitress named Angel who works here. And the only pie we have today is apple and rhubarb." "What? No, you're mistaken," Anson said. "She was just here. She's gorgeous, and she brought me this." He turned to point to his plate and noticed it was gone. The only thing that sat before him was the glass of water he had ordered when he first arrived. There was no napkin, no fork, no empty plate that had contained the pie. "Honey, I've been here since 6 this morning. Only girls here are me and Sherry and Diane. And Diane will be leaving now that breakfast rush is over." "I don't have time for games," Anson said. "Do you know who I am?" Margaret sighed. "I sure do. I know who you are. And I just don't care enough about you to play any kind of games with you, Congressman. And being an elected official and all, you should know that you work for the common folk and shouldn't be so damn snooty." With that, Margaret turned and walked to the next table over, where 2 middle-aged men wearing tattered ball caps were in happy conversation. She flashed a smile at them and said, "Herman, Claude, how are you old 2 coots doing this morning? Can I get y'all the usual?" Anson grimaced at her down-home drawl. Then he stood and walked over to the counter where he could get a look into the kitchen. All he saw were 2 short-order cooks flipping pancakes and sausage on a griddle. Angel was nowhere to be seen. He was frustrated and becoming angry. He considered himself the smartest man in Nevermore, but he could not explain what had just happened. Angel had been real, and he had eaten the extraordinary Ravenberry pie, but the plate and the fork had disappeared. And Angel clearly was not here in the diner. He didn't sense that Margaret, that wretch of a woman, was toying with him. He felt that she had told the truth. His original thought that Angel had been sent by his political adversaries to sabotage his career clawed its way back into his mind. It was completely possible that she had come on to him and convinced him to eat the pie, and that it had been laced with a drug of some sort. Maybe she had taken the plate after he had finished, but he couldn't remember because the drug was messing with his memory. That doesn't hold up to logic, he thought. If I had short-term memory loss due to some drug, I wouldn't remember her. Would I? Can I help you, sir? Anson was pulled from his thoughts. He realized he was still standing at the counter and must have looked confused as he was deep in his reverie. The waitress named Sherry stood across the counter from him, a concerned look on her face, which angered him. I'm rich and powerful, and I don't need her concern, he thought. I am the master of my destiny. I'm all right, he said, his tone sharp. Does Angel work here? Sherry shook her head. I'm sorry. There's no Angel here. Why do you ask? Anson ignored her question. Do you have any Ravenberry pie? I've never heard of it, Sherry said. Is there even such a thing? But I can get you a slice of apple or rhubarb. Anson was both angry and confused. I've been drugged, he thought. That's the only thing that makes sense. He turned without replying to Sherry and stepped out into the glorious afternoon sun. It was late summer, the rays of the sun painting everything with a golden patina. Winona's sat a couple of miles past the town, and the parking lot was surrounded by Dunwich State Forest that was filled with ancient oaks and poplars and the occasional palmetto. And though the day was brilliant and inviting, the forest, as it always did, seemed dark and menacing. The incongruity of the idyllic sun and the foreboding forest only served to sharpen the edge in his soul. He got into his Bentley and pulled out onto the county road that would take him back to his mansion on the other side of Nevermore. As he drove, he worked through the encounter at Winona's. He knew that all manner of strange things happened in this hellhole of a town, and that a great many of the people believed they were paranormal, even possibly evil. He had never believed in evil. He believed life was short, and you were either the hunter or the prey. And that philosophy led him to the idea that evil was a concept created by those who were at the mercy of those who were bold enough to take what they wanted. So, as he drove his Bentley into the gated community that separated his mansion from the sheeple he ruled, he concluded that either Angel had drugged him, or he had suffered a hallucination brought on by the stress and anxiety of launching a presidential campaign. They were the only scenarios that made sense. By the time he parked his Bentley beside his Tesla inside his 8-car garage, he was shaking. He would never be president if he were so incautious as to let his enemies use a beautiful woman to slip him a drug, or worse, if he were on the verge of a mental or emotional collapse brought on by stress. He stepped through the spacious foyer, through the massive home, to the room he used as an office. He sat at his desk, opened up his laptop, and began searching for information on the causes of hallucinations. Within only a few minutes, he was worried enough that he called his personal physician and demanded that she come to his home and give him a full physical. He tossed his phone onto his desk and walked across the house to the kitchen where Andre, his personal chef, was setting out various ingredients in preparation for dinner. Good afternoon, sir, Andre said, noting that Anson looked perturbed. How was your lunch? Can I make you a drink? Have you ever heard of ravenberries? Anson asked, ignoring Andre's offer for a drink. Andre shook his head. No, sir. I've never heard of anything like that. Why do you ask? So, there's no such thing as Ravenberry Pie? Again, Andre shook his head. No, not that I've ever heard. Would you like me to research and see if I can find a recipe? No, Anson said, and turned to leave the kitchen but stopped. You know, on second thought, yes, see if you can find out anything about ravenberries or Ravenberry Pie. I want to know something within the next hour. With that, Anson left the kitchen and went upstairs to his bedroom suite to change and freshen up. He washed his face in the enormous ensuite, then sat down in an oversized chair next to the bedroom window looking out onto the manicured 2-acre backyard. He closed his eyes and took note of how he felt. He felt fine. No side effects that would suggest he had somehow been drugged at the diner. The only way that could have happened was with the glass of water he had been served when he sat down. But, upon deeper thought, he was sure he had not taken a sip. He generally refused to drink any water that was not bottled, so it was impossible that he had been drugged. That left anxiety as the possible cause. He was not accustomed to feeling anxious, but announcing his candidacy for president was huge. He wanted to be president so badly, craved the influence and the power that came with holding the most important position in the world, that the mere idea of him losing his party's nomination, or worse, gaining the nomination and then losing the election, brought him a level of stress he had never experienced. He wondered, can anxiety cause hallucinations? The doorbell chimed, echoing through the house. That would be Danielle, his personal physician. He stood, made his way downstairs, and opened the door. Danielle was an attractive woman, early 30s, and very fit. "Danielle, thank you for coming on short notice." "My pleasure," she replied, and stepped inside. "What seems to be the problem?" "I'm a little embarrassed to bring this up, but at lunch today, I believe I experienced a hallucination." Danielle had been walking toward the living room, but stopped in her tracks. She turned, concern on her face. "Hallucinations are serious," she said. "Let's sit and you tell me every detail." Anson told her everything, ending with his concern that maybe he had been drugged. "I can't see how I could have been slipped anything while I was there, unless it was in the water, but I don't remember taking a sip." "Someone could have slipped you something before you even got to the diner," Danielle replied. "Did you ingest anything at all this morning before you left the house, or did you stop for anything along the way?" The idea that he had been drugged before leaving his home disturbed Anson even more. He only kept 2 people on staff. That was Andre, his chef, whom he paid very well and trusted, and Leanne, his maid. And Leanne was not a live-in employee as Andre was. She only worked Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays. She wasn't due in until 5 this evening. "I haven't eaten anything other than the pie since supper last night," he said. "And I can't believe that Andre would have slipped me anything. He's been with me for years." Danielle had brought along her physician's bag. She opened it and took out her stethoscope, a cannula, tourniquet, and 3 blood collection tubes. She took his blood pressure, then began the process of taking blood samples. It is possible for stress and anxiety to cause temporary hallucinations. I'll take these samples back to my office and see what they show. I'll know in about an hour if there's any trace of any kind of drug or sedative. Your blood pressure is great. All signs point to you being healthy. But if your blood chemistry is off, we'll run further tests." Anson didn't want to ask the next question, though it needed asked. Could it be a tumor? Danielle removed the tourniquet and used a Band-Aid to secure a swatch of cotton over the puncture. Tumors can cause hallucinations, but you have no other symptoms of a tumor, and I doubt that is what has caused this hallucination. It's 3 o'clock now, and I should know something by 6 p.m. I'll call you and we can discuss. I'm leaning towards stress. I suggest you lay off the alcohol, drink plenty of healthy fluids, and get rest. Go lay down until I call you. She put everything in her medical bag and left. He sat on the couch, playing over every detail he could remember over the past 24 hours, wondering if there was some way anyone could have slipped him a drug. He could recall nothing. He decided that solution fantasies would be the best way for him to relax. So, he sat in his Italian leather chair, at his hand-carved ornate desk, and let his mind conjure up an exquisite solution to the problem of Congresswoman Tiffany DeLay. Every other member of Congress knew he wielded great power and never questioned his authority. Everyone except Tiffany. "I hate that bitch," he thought. "I wish she would drive off into the Potomac and drown." The idea of Tiffany dying made him smile. If she were removed from the picture, his life would be so much easier. He knew that there were others in Congress who watched her closely when she stood up to him, and he didn't want them to become bold enough that they too might start questioning his authority. He leaned back in his chair, closed his eyes, and let the scene play out in his mind. She's driving home in her Mercedes. chewing that damned nicotine gum that she's always chomping on as she crosses the bridge that spans the Potomac. She chokes on it, then loses control and plunges off the bridge into the water and drowns. That fantasy brought him a good bit of satisfaction. Then he had an idea that made the scenario even better. She doesn't drown. When she hits the water, the airbag deploys and decapitates her. This extra bit of detail made his smile widen. Suddenly, he reached forward, his stomach clenched, and bile rose into his throat. The pain was intense, bringing tears to his eyes. It felt as if something were writhing inside his intestines. He began to retch as he felt his gorge rise. Thick strands of saliva poured from his mouth and onto his desk. He noticed that they were the same shade of bright crimson as the Ravenberry Pie. The pain clawed at his insides as if something were clawing at the lining of his stomach. Then he began to choke as the contents of his stomach wrenched its way into his throat. He couldn't breathe, and his ears popped as something worked its way past his Adam's apple, stretching his throat and making him gag. He heard himself making groaning, gurgling, choking sounds. Tears poured from his eyes and mixed with the thick crimson ropes of saliva that poured from his lips onto his desk. Then, with one final convulsion, he vomited a large black mass covered in thick stomach juices onto the desktop. He fell back into his chair, gasping for air. He reflexively swallowed, and a searing pain shot through his raw throat. He groaned and wiped the tears from his eyes and looked at the thing on the desk. It was a fat, black raven. Most ravens had beaks so black they seemed to absorb light. This raven had a cherry red beak. Anson was gobsmacked. He stared at the bird, mouth agape, a long strand of saliva hanging from his chin. After a long moment, he began to regain his senses. He absent-mindedly swiped the drool from his chin and pushed the chair back from the desk. He couldn't explain why, but he felt shame at what had just happened to him, as if he were a child who had wet the bed. He glanced at the door to make sure Andre had not seen. He was alone. He moved toward the door, intending to shut it to keep this moment completely private, but his legs were weak, shaking, and he almost fell. He steadied himself against the desk, then forced his legs to work as they should, and shut the door. He turned and slowly walked back to the desk. Okay. Did that just really happen? My stomach feels shredded, and my throat is raw from being stretched and scratched. The pain is real. This is not a hallucination. He looked down at the raven laying on its side, covered in stomach juices, the cherry beak glistening in the light of the desk lamp, and knew that he had to touch it, feel it, to be certain that he was not hallucinating. The idea disgusted him, but he knew he had to do it. It had to be done. He reached out an unsteady hand and was suddenly gripped with fear. He reflexively jerked his hand back, then grimaced and forced himself to man up, to touch the damn thing and get it over with. Only then would he know that he was still sane. Then he could set about finding an explanation that made sense as to why he had coughed up a dead bird. He leaned over the raven and moved to poke it with the index finger of his right hand. The bird twitched. Its legs flailed. A wing fluttered. He jerked his hand back, his blood cold and his stomach churning with revulsion. Still lying on its side, the raven opened its eyes and turned its head to look at him. Its eyes glimmered ruby red, and he knew that those feral eyes held the ability to wrench open the secret doors in his heart and discover his darkest thoughts. He stumbled back, one hand over his mouth, the other clutching his chest. The bird rolled over and worked its way up and stood before him, glaring at him. After a moment, the bird opened its mouth and cawed. It was shrill, loud, and plucked at his nerves. The raven took a step toward him and cawed again. The sound grated on his soul. He took a step back and found that his back was against the window. The raven took another step, opened its wings, and flapped them, as if testing their ability to lift it into flight. It cawed again, and Anson realized that what clawed at his nerves was not the caw itself, but that he felt that it carried an accusation. "Screw this," Anson said. He turned and unlocked the window. It was difficult to do with his trembling hands, but after it was open, he stepped away and said, "Go, you bastard! Go!" The raven cocked its head at him, the ruby-red eyes gleaming in the lamplight. He felt shame at its accusation. Then the raven flapped its wings, took flight, and fluttered out into the night. He slammed the window closed and stumbled back. His mind reeled as he fell into his chair. He closed his eyes, grabbed his head with both hands, and tried to calm himself. After a long time, he was calm enough to open his eyes and look at the desk. There was a dark, wet feather where the raven had lain. There was also, mixed in with the saliva and stomach juices, 2 ravenberries. He felt his stomach churn. He turned away, taking deep breaths. "I need to clean this up. Not throw it away," he thought. "I need to give it to Danielle, have her run some tests." He made for the door leading into the hallway and heard the doorbell ring. He glanced at his Rolex and noted that it was just after 6, and Andre would not answer the door because he would be finishing with dinner preparations. Wanting to get whomever it was at the door on their way so he could clean up the mess on his desk, he clambered down the stairs and was surprised when he opened the door to see Danielle. His heart sank. If she were here, then she must have the results of his blood work, and it must not be good. Danielle, I didn't expect to see you." Speaking sent sharp claws of pain through his throat. "I see the fear on your face, Anson," Danielle said. "Don't worry. I didn't find anything life-threatening, but I did find something very curious. So I figured it would be easier to come here and speak with you face to face." Anson stepped aside and ushered her in. "Okay, I'm intrigued. What did you find?" His throat didn't hurt quite as bad this time, but his voice sounded strained, hoarse. "I ran every test I could think of," she said, "and nothing came back that would suggest you were fighting anything life-threatening or that we would need to do further tests. But what I did find, the thing I find most curious, is that you have ornithosis." "Ornithosis?" Anson said. He cleared his throat and winced. What is that?" Now that she was inside and in good light, Danielle saw how pale he was, and she saw red speckles of blood on the front of his white shirt. Her eyes narrowed with concern. "You look terrible. Are you okay? Have you hurt yourself?" Anson knew that he could not tell her every detail of what happened. She would not believe him. Who would? So he told her as much of the truth as he could. "I felt sick a few minutes ago and I threw up." "That's blood on your shirt," she said. She was now in full physician mode. "That worries me. Has this happened before?" "I don't think it's blood," he said. "The pie I ate at lunch, it had filling that was this color." Danielle set her bag on the ornate round table and retrieved a pair of latex gloves. As she snapped them on, she said, "I will want to take a sample just to make sure." "Hang on," Anson said. Even in his weakened and worried state, he didn't like anyone establishing any form of dominance over him. He wanted to take control. In fact, he needed to take control. "First, tell me what ornithosis is." "It's an infection you get from birds." Anson wasn't sure what he wanted to hear when asking for an explanation of what ornithosis was, but he would never have guessed that it was something related to birds. He felt dizzy. He took an unsteady breath. and a trembling began at his core. "Birds?" he said, his voice a shaky croak. Danielle put a hand on his shoulder, steadying him. "Yes, birds. Have you been handling any birds lately? And maybe you should sit down. You look like you're going to faint." Anger welled up inside Anson. "I'm a wealthy, powerful man," he thought. "I don't faint." With that, he willed himself to get control of his trembling. He cleared his throat, wincing again as he did so, and said, "No, I haven't been around any birds." Then he remembered that he was about to ask her upstairs to his study to have her collect and analyze the contents that he had puked up. Mixed with the ravenberries was a feather. How do I explain that? "Are you sure?" she asked. "That's pretty much the only way you can get ornithosis." Anson had an idea. "You know, on second thought, I did find a feather recently. For some reason, I picked it up and kept it. In fact, when I got sick earlier, I was holding it. Maybe you can come upstairs and collect it. Run some tests on it." Danielle looked skeptical. People don't usually get sick just from feathers, but under the circumstances, that has to be the only explanation. She took her bag from the table. "Lead the way. I'll take it with me, and I'd like a sample of whatever else came up. Maybe you ingested something that was infected with the bacteria." Anson forced himself to walk confidently and steadily up the stairs. They stepped into his study, and he pointed at the desk. That feeling of shame welled up inside him again, and he grimaced and beat it back down. "I was just about to clean it up when you arrived. I'm sorry for the mess." "Don't be," Danielle said. "I spent 8 years as an ER nurse. I've seen some disgusting things. Besides, it's not your fault." She sat her bag on the desk and retrieved 2 biohazard specimen kits. She turned her attention to the mess and said, "What are those?" "Ravenberries," he said. She scrunched up her face and thought, "What are ravenberries?" "Some sort of rare berry. It was in the pie I ate. You've never heard of them?" Danielle shook her head. "No." She leaned over and took a closer look. Then she stood, confusion and concern darkening her face. "You coughed those up?" "Yes." "Why?" "Anson, those aren't berries." Anson felt the worry peck at his nerves. He also felt anger because whatever was happening was out of his control. He did not like not having control. And again, he felt shame. "Then what are they?" he asked. "Those are hearts." "Hearts?" he asked, not following. "What do you mean?" "I dated a veterinarian for 3 years," she said, "and we used to discuss how different species all share some basic physiology. For example, various animal species may look drastically different than us humans, but they may all have kidneys, lungs, and hearts that look very similar to ours. And I can tell you that these are not berries. They are hearts." Anson became even dizzier. He sat down in his chair, realized his mouth was agape, and he was fidgeting with his hands. He tried to force himself into calmness, but was only moderately successful. "Are you saying I ate a pie filled with hearts?" Danielle collected the tiny red clumps. She held up her specimen bag and said, "Yes, and from the look of it, these are bird hearts." Anger flared up inside Anson. It was a white-hot rage at the damned waitress who had tricked him into eating a pie filled with the hearts of birds. The rage burned away his dizziness, his tremors, and his shame, and he knew without a doubt that he would kill the bitch. "There was a waitress who convinced me to eat this pie. Do you think she was trying to make me sick?" Danielle shrugged. "It's possible. Most people who contract ornithosis quickly find treatment, but yes, people have died. At the very least, this waitress was wanting you to be very sick. If she collected those hearts from sick birds and you were to eat them in any real quantity, then it's quite possible the sickness would be sudden enough that you could die before receiving treatment. Anson stood, now in righteous control. He was steady. He had his wits about him, and he was pissed. Thank you, Danielle. How long will it take for you to run the tests on these? I was going to take the rest of the night off, but this is too fascinating. I will go directly back to my office and begin. I should have something by midnight. I'll call you then. Anson thanked her, walked her down the stairs, and saw her out the door. He then gathered the supplies he needed and cleaned up the mess on his desk. As he cleaned, he decided to use Byron Driver, a private detective he kept on retainer, to hunt Angel down. Satisfied that his PI would be successful, Anson stepped over to his expansive walk-in closet and selected a pair of $1,500 silk pajamas. It was only 6 p.m., but he hoped that by wrapping himself in luxury and sitting in his huge bed, he would regain a feeling of normalcy, though he doubted he would ever feel normal again after vomiting up the Raven. He climbed into bed, propped himself up with fluffy pillows, and reached for his phone, intending to call Byron. He wanted to know everything there was to know about Angel. He needed to know how she convinced him to eat that damned pie. Did she use hypnosis? Is that how she was able to remove the plate without him knowing? Was she working for one of his political opponents? He wanted answers. But just as his fingers touched the phone, it rang. He saw that it was Anna, his chief of staff. Yes, he said, answering the call. Have you heard? Anna said. About what? He replied. He noted that his throat hurt much less when speaking, and he sounded almost normal. Tiffany DeLay, Anna said, excitement in her voice. She's dead. Anson shot up out of his bed. His mind raced, his heart hammered. He began to pace the room as he spoke. How? What happened? Car wreck, Anna said. She drove her Mercedes into the Potomac about 30 minutes ago. It's on the news right now. Anson was speechless. He stopped pacing and stared blankly at the floor. How can this be? He thought. It's impossible. There's no way this could happen exactly the way I imagined it. After his long pause, Anna said, Anson, are you okay? I know it's a shock, but now that she's out of the way, there's no one standing in the way of your agenda. Anson pulled himself back to the moment. I'm okay. And yes, this is good news for us. Hang on a minute. I want to turn on the news so I can see what's being said. He snatched his tablet and logged onto the news. An impossibly beautiful blonde reporter with an out-of-place smile stood on a bridge. There were fire trucks, police cars, and a rescue crew behind her, their lights pulsing. I just spoke with a source on the scene who say that divers have recovered the Congresswoman's body, the pretty reporter said. Her smile widened, and there was a gleam in her eye as if she were a jackal tearing at the flesh of a fresh kill. They say that she was decapitated, likely due to the deployment of her airbag. No way, Anson thought. This is some insane coincidence. There's no way I made this happen just by thinking it. Then, the camera moved from the reporter to get a shot of the first responders, and he saw a thick black raven with a cherry-red beak and ruby-colored eyes sitting on the railing. It turned toward the camera and cawed. Anson flung the tablet across the room as if he had just realized he were holding a viper. His skin crawled. He heard himself tell Anna that he had to go, and he disconnected the call, and his phone slipped from his hand onto the floor. He shuffled over to the bed, his mind reeling. What's happening? He croaked. Are you okay, sir? Andre said from his door. There was concern on his face. I just heard what happened to the Congresswoman. Yes, Anson said. I need to be alone. Leave me be. Andre turned and shut the door behind him. Anson's mind refused to focus, refused to order his thoughts. He slid off the bed and sat in a chair that he kept in the corner for reading. He leaned over and put his head in his hands. I made this happen. There's no other explanation. I thought about Tiffany's death, then coughed up that damned bird, and now she's dead. It was the same bird. Ravens don't typically have red beaks. It has to be the same bird. After a while, he began to regain his calm, and he was able to think more clearly. I wonder if that was a one-time event, or if it will happen every time I think about people dying. As soon as he considered this, his mind shot to two of his more favored solution fantasies. It happened too quickly for him to stop the images from flashing through his mind. Justin Kane was an 80-year-old neighbor who had used the neighborhood alliance against Anson last year to block him from holding a campaign fundraiser at his own home. Justin drove a golf cart around the neighborhood that grated on Anson's nerves. It was painted in red sparkle and had a bumper sticker that said, "Term limits for all politicians." Marilyn Krieger was the neighbor across the way whose pit bull, named Sweetie, was always running free and terrorizing the neighborhood. Anson had a 2-4 solution fantasy for those two pains in the ass. He had often fantasized that Sweetie would maul that Botox-loving hag, Marilyn, then chase after Justin as he drove his stupid golf cart with his anti-politician bumper sticker and rip out the old man's throat. As soon as the thought crossed his mind, Anson's stomach lurched. Pain ripped through his torso as he felt something large begin to squirm and claw at his insides. It worked its way up, stretching his throat, gagging him, choking him. His ears began to ring as he lurched forward in the chair. Thick strips of acidic drool dangled from his chin. His throat bulged. Pain shot through his neck, and his head pounded from the effort. Then another fat raven fell from his mouth onto the floor. This raven also had a cherry red beak. Its eyes popped open and looked directly at him. It worked its way up onto its feet and flapped its wings, splattering bile and saliva onto Anson's $2,000 slippers. Then the bird cawed at him, as if in judgment, and took flight and crashed through the bedroom window. Anson wiped tears from his eyes and drool from his chin. I can't take another one of these. I can't. It will kill me. Then another solution fantasy popped into his mind. This one concerned Andre. While he trusted Andre, he had seen too much behind the curtain, knew too many of Anson's dark secrets. He'd often fantasized that Andre would be stupid enough to put his hand in the garbage disposal when it was running, causing his hand to be chewed off, and then he'd bleed out. His stomach clenched again. He heaved and coughed up another raven. His throat was raw and sore and now bleeding as the thick black bird squeezed through and fell onto the floor. It pushed itself up, turned its ruby red eyes and crimson beak toward him, and cawed in judgment. It took flight through the door, into the hallway, and down the stairs. A moment later, Andre screamed. It was a long wail, full of pain and terror. Then there was quiet. "Oh, no, no more, please," Anson croaked. He was full on crying from pain. He pushed himself up from the chair and stumbled against the wall. He regained his balance and walked on shaky legs down the stairs and into the kitchen. The garbage disposal was running. The sink and kitchen walls were splattered in visceral arterial sprays. Andre lay on the floor in a growing pool of blood. He was shaking, his eyes wide with shock. His lips were blue and his skin was pale from blood loss. He looked up at Anson, his face a mask of fear and confusion. "Why did I do that?" he whispered. Then, The sparkle of life left his eyes. Anson heard a ruffle of wings and turned to see the raven that had flown down the stairs, sitting on one of the granite-covered counters. It turned its unblinking stare on Anson and cawed. The coppery smell of blood hit Anson's nose. He was going to vomit, and he instinctively raced to the blood-splattered sink. He retched. Searing pain ripped through his throat, but nothing came up. He stepped away, his hands now smeared in Andre's blood. He reached for a towel and heard the wail of sirens. He stumbled out of the kitchen, through the front door, and out into the twilight evening. He shuffled down the driveway and looked out his gate. The sun slipped below the horizon and the decorative street lamps blinked on. The scene before him was chaotic. Marilyn's body lay on the sidewalk in front of her own spacious home. Sweetie was mauling her, tearing at her face and neck, growling as if he were the guardian of the gates of hell and had just stopped her from entering without her ticket. The neighbors were out, watching, some of the women crying, some of the teenagers had their phones out, recording the scene. Justin Kane came flying around the corner in his ridiculous golf cart, not aware of the deadly situation that was unfolding. Sweetie stopped gnawing at Marilyn's face. He turned, lowered his head, gave a guttural growl, and took off toward the cart. Justin's eyes shot wide, and he made the mistake of slowing down to try and turn the cart around. Sweetie jumped into the cart and bit into Justin's throat. Blood sprayed. Justin tried to scream, but only gurgled. Sweetie wrenched his neck back and forth, tearing flesh and breaking bone. The neighborhood was a gated community. The sirens Anson had heard were a sheriff's patrol car and an ambulance. They had gotten stuck at the main gate, but now they careened around the curve onto the scene. The deputy jumped out of the car, pulled his weapon, and shot Sweetie 4 times before putting down the ravenous beast. Anson heard a call and watched as a cherry-beaked raven settled on top of the golf cart. It turned and looked directly at him. Anson turned from the gate and stumbled back to the house. He reached for the doorknob and saw that his hand had become gnarled at the knuckles, as if he had suddenly developed arthritis. He looked at his other hand and saw that it too had become gnarled and smaller. He pushed through the door and lurched into the downstairs bathroom and looked in the mirror. His heart pounded, and his mind reeled as he watched the skin on his nose begin to split open, revealing a crimson-red beak. No. This can't be happening. He tried to reach up and touch the beak that was sprouting from his nose, but his hands would not work. In fact, Anson could not feel any part of his body any longer. There was no pain, not in his stomach or his raw throat. There was only cold numbness. He began to realize that his whole being seemed to be reduced to the beak that was working its way from his face. What's happening? Am I dying? Am I losing my mind? Blood seeped down his face. He could feel pressure in his skull as the beak broke the bones in his face and ripped through the skin. His eyes bulged, the left orb rolling out of its socket to dangle against his cheek. The vision in his right eye began to darken, but not before he witnessed his face split wide open as a raven pushed its shiny black head through and blink open its ruby-red eyes. Then his vision changed, as if he were seeing everything through crimson lenses. He was now seeing through the eyes of the raven crawling from his head. He felt his raven self hop from his human body and onto the sink counter. He heard the body hit the floor with a meaty thud. His body was now that of the raven, but his presence, his soul, his psyche was Anson. It was too much to comprehend, and his mind threatened to snap. As he wrestled with sanity, he heard someone enter the bathroom, and he turned. Angel stood in the doorway, still dressed in her throwback waitress uniform, a pleased look on her face. She was as gorgeous as she was in the diner at lunch, but through his raven eyes he could see a dark aura around her. "You're ready to harvest," she said. Anson did not understand what she meant by that cryptic statement. He opened his mouth to ask her to explain, but when he spoke, all that was uttered was a pleading squawk. Angel tilted her head, clearly understanding the question behind the cry. "Of course. You want to understand," she said. "Everyone who ends up in your situation needs to know why." Angel stepped further into the bathroom and shut the door behind her. Anson's raven heart fluttered in terror. He cawed and hopped back, looking around for a way to flee, but this was only a half bath in the downstairs hallway and had no windows to the outside. There was nowhere for Anson to go. "You're a terrible man with a poisoned mind," Angel said. "You spend so much energy thinking up devilishly creative ways to make those you hate suffer. It makes your heart wicked in a very special way." Anson could feel evil radiating from her dark aura. He tried to flap his wings, knowing he had to flee from this beautiful monster, but he didn't quite know how. They impotently flopped at his sides. Angel stepped over his human body and hovered over Anson. "I have sensed you for a while now, as you worked out those twisted solutions in your mind." Anson didn't understand. He didn't care. He wanted to be away from this creature who seemed to be a beautiful woman but was clearly something repulsive and inhuman. He had heard the rumors that Nevermore had a paranormal underbelly. He had never really believed it until now. But with this new understanding, surely there was someone or something that lived here that could help him reverse this curse. "I have to fight," he thought. "Figure out a way to escape." Angel gave him a knowing smile. "I know what you're thinking," she said in a sing-song voice. "But there's no escape. If you don't already know, those were not berries you ate in the pie earlier. They were raven hearts, all of them normal except for one very special heart from a very special raven like yourself." "What does that mean?" He opened his beak and gave a long, shrill warning. Angel took another step closer, blocking him into the corner where the counter met the wall. "Centuries ago, when I was a young girl, I was visited by a raven named Misery who whispered in my ear. Misery sang to me a wicked little secret. She told me that if I fed her heart to a person with a poisoned mind, their evil thoughts would come true, and I could live forever off the dark energy that was released." Anson tried with all his might to make his wings work. If nothing else, he could take flight and make it more difficult for her to catch him. Maybe it would buy him enough time to figure out how to escape. His wings fluttered. A surge of hope rushed through him. He hopped as far away from her as he could on the counter. Anson tried to flap his wings, and this time it worked. They flapped, but not enough for him to have power to take flight. Angel pulled a knife from the deep pocket of her uniform. It was razor sharp, and the edge gleamed in the bathroom lights. "I set Misery free and fed her heart to my husband, who was a vile and abusive man. And I found that Misery told the truth. He turned into a wicked little raven. Then I took his heart, fed it to another, harvested that heart, and another for hundreds of years." Anson cawed, a desperate plea. "Of course, not everyone is willing to eat a raven's heart, no matter the promise. But I discovered that if I slip the heart into a beautiful exotic dessert, along with a promise that they will receive their deepest desires, people like yourself are greedy enough to eat it. I used a tiny bit of magic to cloud your mind, enough to believe that the hearts were berries." Before Anson could react, Angel shot her hand out, cat-quick, and snatched him by the throat. She forced him down onto his back. He scratched at her hand with his claws, but she seemed not to care. She raised the knife and said, "Now that I've fed on the chaos you created, it's time to harvest your wicked little heart and feed it to the next twisted soul." Anson felt a searing pain as the knife plunged into his chest. He watched as Angel began to carefully carve through his ribs. The last thing he saw was Angel holding up his raven heart with a wide, hungry smile. Then he slipped into a terrible darkness that seemed to be heated with the fire of 1,000 suns.